So you mentioned that your job in some senses was to facilitate putting a lot of these countries into debt, in order to make them enslaved, for one word, or at least heavily indebted to the United States, or financial institutions of the United States, and you give them far more leverage over them within international geopolitics, and when it came to deciding who got contracts maybe for resource extraction, is I wondered, throughout reading this, there was like a little bit of me that was just thinking, is it always bad for foreign banks or industries to invest in a country? There was part of me that wonders, was there a version of this story where America's investment in developing nations could have been prosperous, or do you think that always would lead to exploitation of the indebted party?
Well, it depends on the lending company's motives, and also the people in charge of the creditor, of the debtor country, what their motives are. And the problem really was that our motives were almost always to obtain so I was assigned to work in countries that had resources we wanted, like oil, and today lithium, cobalt, rare minerals. And the best way to get those at a cheap price and without many environmental or social regulations is to put the country deep into debt, and then work out a deal whereby you forgive some of the debt, or you drop the interest rates a little bit or whatever, in exchange for what we call conditionalities, and those would include getting this resource real cheap without environmental and social regulations, perhaps building a military base on their soil, by getting them to vote with us on the next United Nations vote against Cuba or whatever, privatizing their government sectors like water and sewage systems and selling them to our investors. So that was in my day, and I think continuing today, that is the motive. And I think that's also the motive for the most part with China's programs today, which are outpacing ours in many respects. So the idea that foreign aid could help, yes, absolutely. And an example of that was the Marshall Plan in Europe after World War II. And that was the World Bank. The World Bank was formed to do that in 1944 during the Bretton Woods conferences. The IMF, the World Bank, and a few other institutions were formed to help Europe recover from the devastation of World War II. And it did that quite well. And I think that was somewhat, philanthropic. It was also self-serving for the United States, because here we were building a barrier against the Soviet Union. The Cold War is growing. Europe is a great barrier for the United States, a protector. And we were building a market. But at the same time, we truly were investing in programs that I think helped the majority of the people. And that would be the driving factor. So almost all the projects I was involved with were helping the very rich. We were building, our projects were huge infrastructure projects, electric power systems, highways, airports, ports, industrial parks, things that really helped the people who owned big industry, who owned the commercial sector. And it didn't help the majority of the people. In fact, in most cases, it hurt them because money that had been earmarked for healthcare and education and other social services was diverted to paying off the interest on the loans. And so, and then when we go in as a conditionality, often that also includes these austerity programs, which mean cutting taxes on the rich and cutting wages on everybody else. So in most cases, what we were doing was putting countries in what we call the debt trap, and that basically makes them subservient to us, as you said, essentially kind of slave nations.
Do you think those institutions are sort of beyond help, like the World Bank, the IMF? I mean, there's a lot of people who really don't like them. Is there a way in which they could become the kind of institutions that do the work that that took place in the Marshall Plan and sort of try and create prosperity instead of this debt enslavement?
Well, let's use USAID, Agency for International Development, which Trump has just done away with. It's an example of an agency, I think, that was in the process of making a transition, partly because it had begun hiring people that came out of the United States middle class, and they would rise to high positions. And these were people that included environmentalists, included people interested in humanitarianism. So USAID was in this position of attracting people who were not members of what we might call the military-industrial complex. While the World Bank, and let me continue that. So USAID was increasingly investing a lot more money every year in humanitarian projects and disease controlling projects, like with COVID and getting rid of smallpox. And I mean, they were doing some really good programs. In my day, they were much more exploitative. They were more connected with the World Bank, but that was changing. So that is a possibility. The problem with the World Bank, the IMF, and those other institutions is that the leadership tends to come from ministers of finance from all these other countries, or even presidents, or people high up in the governments of other countries. They are part of this inner circle globally that benefits from developing these big infrastructure projects. So the momentum is not there. I've spoken at the World Bank, surprisingly, after the book came out. I was invited to speak. And afterwards, a bunch of young, fairly new employees, about 24 of them, asked to have dinner with me, and I did. And they complained that a lot of them said they'd come as idealists. They wanted to do good things in the world, but once they're at the bank, they found that there's tremendous inertia against that everything was oriented toward these big projects that helped the very wealthy families. And in that process, you see GDP growing, the statistic which the World Bank likes to use, which is really a measurement of how well the rich are doing. It's not a measurement of overall prosperity, even though it's touted as a measure of overall prosperity in GDP per capita. Everybody's in part of that per capita, whereas per capita is just GDP divided by the population. So it's a very deceptive statistic.
Good news, everyone. My book about GameStop, the craziest story ever told, is now finished. Well, almost. Still waiting for the final draft. So, in the meantime, I think you should look at pre-ordering it or any one of the multiple fantastic, beautiful t-shirts that I have designed in order to sell with the book. Thank you, everyone, for your patience over the last few years while I have been finishing it very slowly. And I am really, really excited for people to read it. Link is in the description below. Enjoy the podcast.